In this exercise, I'm going to explain how cache levels work inside of Photoshop. I'll also tell you how and why you might want to modify the number of cache levels that Photoshop tracks at any given moment in time. Now, this topic is somewhat academic. I want to warn you about that in advance. But it's of keen interest to any student of Photoshop, and I just have to change the number of cache levels to effectively demonstrate how the auto commands work inside of this fatherofourmoney.psd file. Now, notice right off the bat that I've gone ahead and moved this ginormous histogram panel into the panel dock over here on the right-hand side of the screen. I also saved out a new workspace called Big Histograms. So I still have my original workspace one-on-one, which I could switch to at any time. But notice if I switch to one-on-one like so, it doesn't really change things very much. And that's because Photoshop is constantly updating the workspaces on the fly. And this was the last state of that one-on-one workspace. So it seems as though I've completely messed things up. However, all I have to do is click on this icon once again and choose Reset One-on-One. And then it goes back to its familiar appearance without the ginormous histogram panel. And even if I bring up the histogram panel, it'll come up small, which is great because that's the way I created one-on-one in the first place. Now, if I want to switch back to the big histogram panel, all I have to do is click on Big Histograms, and I created that workspace, incidentally, by choosing the New Workspace command. All right, so having done that, here's a reminder. Every time I switch to a different layer or apply so much as a command to a layer here inside of Photoshop, the histogram's going to get messed up. And it's going to have this little warning, which tells me that it's working from cached data, which is to say it's not entirely accurate. It's taking a lower resolution image into account. I can see that the cache level is 3. Unless it's 1, it's not quite accurate. So the lower the number, the better. However, 1 means accuracy. And the only way to get a cache level of 1 is to either click this warning or click on this little refresh icon right there, or you can choose this command from the panel's flyout menu, uncached refresh. Either of those will do it. Now, unfortunately, uncached refresh doesn't stick. It'd be great if you had a way just to choose a command, and every time Photoshop would go ahead and build a histogram from cache level 1. However, that's not an option. What is an option is to change the number of cache levels, and you can do that. And here's where things get a little bit intricate. You press Control-K or Command-K on the Mac to bring up the Preferences dialog box, and you switch over to Performance right there. And notice we have this Cache Levels option. Now, when I hover over this area, this history and cache area, that is to say, you'll see a description of everything that's going on in this region down in the description field at the bottom of the dialog box. So I can't point to it because I'm busy hovering up here. But if you look down at the word description there at the bottom of the dialog box, the third line is the beginning of the discussion of cache levels. And it says the number of cache levels of image data, meaning these are varieties of the image that are stored in memory by Photoshop. It's used to improve the screen redraw and histogram speed, and it makes a big, huge difference in that regard. So it does definitely increase the speed at which the histograms are drawn. That doesn't matter very much to us, but the speed at which the screen is redrawn matters a great deal. And so decreasing this cache levels value can have a negative effect on screen redraw inside of Photoshop. And then it goes on to advise us, choose more cache levels, meaning that you can take this value as high as 8, incidentally. So you would raise that value for bigger documents with fewer layers. And that's the way that this area thinks in general. You either have your standard everyday average composition, which is of medium size with, let's say, 20 or 30 layers inside of it. And that's what Photoshop is designed to accommodate by default. Or if we raise this cache levels value, then it's going to better accommodate big, huge photographs, for example, with just a few layers, which might better serve the needs of digital photographers, for example, especially if you're stitching together enormous panoramas. Then you might want to raise that cache levels value. The next sentence says choose fewer cache levels. It means lower the value for smaller documents with many layers. So you can take this value down as low as 2 is what this little warning recommends. Doesn't like you to go any lower than 2 because then you're really sucking up resources where Photoshop is concerned and the program's going to slow down. But this might better suit your needs if you're a web designer, for example. If you're working on small images and you have hundreds of layers inside that image, this is the better way to go. And then finally, it says changes will take effect the next time you start Photoshop, which is indicative of most of the options inside of this panel of the Preferences dialog box. In fact, there's really just one exception, history states. You can change the number of history states on the fly without restarting the program. Bear in mind, of course, that just because you take the number of history states from 20 up to 40, And that's 40 per open image. You have to bear that in mind. That's also asking Photoshop to suck up a lot of resources there. But just because you do that doesn't mean you somehow magically retrieve history state 21, which has fallen off of the list. Anyway, I'm going to leave that value alone. What I am going to do is, even though Photoshop doesn't recommend it, I'm going to take the number of cache levels down to 1. I don't recommend you do this either. This is purely for demonstrational purposes, a cache level of 1, that is. So if you're teaching Photoshop in a classroom environment, you might have reason to do this. Otherwise, you don't. Otherwise, if everything seems to be responding just fine in Photoshop, leave cache level set to 4. If you're working on big, huge images without that many layers, why, then take it up perhaps to 6. And then if you're a web designer and you have fairly small images with 100 or more layers inside of them, then you might take this value as low as 2. Anyway, as I say, I'm going to lower the cache levels to 1. I'm going to click OK, and then I'm going to restart the program. And I'll go ahead and do that without you. And then in the next exercise, I will have restarted, and we'll get down to how the auto commands work.